Greetings from 316 Mainling Hall. This is Father Jim Gallagher. I'm going to teach you how to make the very beginnings of the dough for a very simple focaccia. So this is making the dough. We're going to need to leave the dough in the fridge for a while for it to ferment and rise and start to become itself. But this is just how to put it together. And then when we're together in person, we'll take it out of the fridge, we'll turn it into focaccia, put it in the oven, and it'll be beautiful. So first thing you're going to do whenever you're working with food is you're going to wash your hands. I did that just before I started the camera here, so wash your hands first. And then we need 4 basic ingredients. We need flour, salt, yeast, and water. That's it. And that's what we're going to make our focaccia out of. I'm going to use a little bit of oil, but the dough itself. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to measure out 2 cups of flour. So we've got a bowl, we've got a measuring cup. So if you are new to baking, don't worry about it. Give it a go. It's going to be easy. This is an easy thing to do. But the thing to know is when you're measuring out flour, fill the measuring cup, but then you use something with a straight edge like a knife, and you just kind of level off the top of the flour to make sure that you only have a cup of flour. And you pour that in. Second cup, 2 cups. We're going to use 2 cups of flour. The flour that I'm using right here is a bread flour, but for this recipe, if you just have the regular all-purpose flour in your cabinet, use that. Don't make a special trip to the grocery store to get bread flour. Just whatever regular flour you have, 2 cups of that, boom, there you go. And then what you're going to do is you're going to add 1 teaspoon of salt. So again, I got the teaspoon, I got the salt, 1 teaspoon. Again, here you can use something with a flat edge to kind of scrape it off to make sure you get just that 1 teaspoon. Add that 1 teaspoon of salt into the 2 cups of flour. And then I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of yeast. What I've got is a little bit of a jar of Fleshman's Active Dry Yeast. For this recipe too, if you don't have some of this in the fridge, you can just go to the grocery store and there's little packets of it as well, which is all you'll need for this. So you don't need to get a whole big thing of yeast if you don't have any yeast. But you're going to use 1 teaspoon of yeast. Again, level that off and pour it in there. So I've got my 1 teaspoon of yeast, my 1 teaspoon of salt, my 2 cups of flour. I'm going to take a fork, my bowl with dry ingredients, and just going to mix those around to spread those out a bit. And then the last thing I'm going to add to this is 1 cup of warm water. So you're just going to take your tap, run the tap all the way over the hot water, let it run a little bit. You don't want it like hot water where you can't keep your finger in there, but you kind of get your finger in there and it's hot. That's the cup of water you want. So I've already measured out my 1 cup of hot water, very warm. You're going to add that in. You're just going to slowly kind of add that water into the flour, salt, and the yeast. And using the fork, I'm just going to mix it together. You're going to get all the dry ingredients wet. So you're going to mix what you have in there with the water. As it gets wet, it'll kind of stiffen up a little bit. And then you got to be careful that you don't get flour flying all over the place. But then you just kind of give it a good stir. What I do is I kind of mash the middle into the sides of the bowl, just kind of getting all of your dry ingredients wet with the water. And then with this one, it kind of gets to a point where it's getting dry but a little bit sticky. So I'm going to use my knife, get the dough off the fork, and then just use my hands. This is why I washed my hands. Kind of take the dough, work it around a little bit, make sure to get all of that dry stuff wet, the wet stuff dry. And as you work it, it'll kind of keep getting sticky because you're getting all the dry stuff into the wet stuff. The neat thing too is what you're doing with working the dough a little bit is you're getting the gluten in the flour. That's the thing that makes the bonds, and that's what holds the bubbles that the yeast is going to make in the dough. So we got that, and it's getting good and sticky, and no more dry spots. So I'm going to try and get as much of the dough off my fingers back into the dough. Knife comes in handy for that again. Just kind of scrape all the dough off your hand back into the bowl. And then, this is the one ingredient I forgot to take out of the cabinet before I started going here. But I'm going to grab a little bit of oil, just a little bit of vegetable oil out of my cabinet because I have a second bowl here. I'm actually going to wash some of the dough off my fingers. So washing dough off the fingers. Grabbing the vegetable oil. Now what I do is I've got another bowl. I'm going to put just a little dab of the oil in the bowl to keep the dough from sticking to it. Got to put a little dab in there, and you use your fingers to whisk it around to coat the bottom. This is the fun thing about baking. You get your hands in it. Got to feel it. All right, now what you're going to do is take your dough and put it into the clean bowl. Just going to scrape it off the sides of the bottom and just plop it in there. Then what you're going to do is you can put some plastic wrap over the top. I tend not to be the biggest fan of using plastic wrap, so I just have a plate. And I take a plate on the top, seals it pretty well enough. Not perfectly airtight, but my experience is it does the trick. And what I'm going to do then is put this in the refrigerator, and it's going to sit overnight, 12 to 24 hours. So if we're going to do this in an evening, we want our focaccia in the evening, you make it the night before. You just mix the dough together, you put it in there, and you just leave it alone. So that's your dough. And now time is going to do its work, and the yeast is going to do its work. It's going to eat some of the sugars, it's going to produce a gas, it's going to start to get the dough to rise. So then the last thing you're going to do before we meet again to turn this dough into bread is about 2 hours before we want to put it into the oven, we take it out of the fridge. So you're going to put it in the fridge, leave it for 12 to 24 hours. Then 2 hours before we're going to use it, you pull it back out of the fridge, put it on the countertop, let it come up to room temperature. It'll rise a little bit more. And then we'll do the final work before we put it in the oven and make it into the focaccia bread that we will eat and enjoy. So there you go. 2 cups of flour, 1 teaspoon salt, 1 teaspoon yeast, 1 cup of warm water. Mix that all together. Put a little oil in the bowl. Put the dough in the bowl. Put that in the fridge. There you go. See you when it comes time to turn this into bread.